Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar. My name is Sharon Larkin, and I will be your moderator today. I am a Senior Marketing Manager at Brooks Publishing, who is our proud sponsor for today's webinar. Before I turn it over to our presenter, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items that I'd like to review with you. For those of you who are watching this webinar live, please take a moment to download the webinar housekeeping document. You will find that in the handouts pane of your control panel. If you're watching the recording of this webinar, you can download that document at bit.ly/screen-with-TILLS. This document is going to provide all the information you need to know about today's webinar, which will include information about how to obtain your ASHA CEUs or a certificate of attendance. It will also include information about where to view the recording of this webinar and how to obtain a copy of Dr. Anderson's slides. We will also, it has information on a 10% off discount code from Brooks Publishing, and we've listed that code up there on the screen. It is good through November 17th. We are very excited that we can offer ASHA CEUs for people who are watching this webinar live. To earn your CEUs, you just need to make sure that you watch the entire webinar and then complete the exit survey at the end. And that survey will appear once the webinar has ended. If you entered your ASHA membership number when you registered, that's all you need to do. Watch the webinar all the way through, complete the survey, and you're good. Then you can expect to see your CEUs posted in about 3 to 4 weeks. If you did not enter your ASHA membership number when you registered, but you still want to get CEUs for today, just go ahead and send me an email at the email that you have on the screen. It says brookswebmeeting@brookspublishing.com, and then we can get everything sorted out. And it is important to note that we are only able to offer CEUs for those who attend the webinar live today and not those who watch the recording. I would also like to mention that we are so proud to partner with the Maryland Speech Language Hearing Association to offer CEUs for today's event, but it is important to note that the views expressed in today's webinar are not necessarily those of the Maryland Speech Language Hearing Association, its board members, or membership. And finally, if you have any questions during today's presentation, type them into your question pane and we will address as many as we can during the Q&A session. If we can't get to them, then we will send you an email with the response. So without further delay, it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Michele Anderson. Dr. Anderson is the TILLS Project Coordinator and co-author of the TILLS Student Language Scale. Dr. Anderson, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Sharon, and thank you to Brooks Publishing for putting this webinar on. Thanks to all of you who are joining us on this afternoon. I'm really excited by the challenge of what I'm calling a sprint webinar, trying to get through all of this information in 30 minutes. But if you're like me, if it can be done efficiently and quickly, that's what we're after. So let me start with the disclosure and acknowledgments. We were able to complete the TILLS validation study and norming study because we had help from an Institute of Education Sciences grant to Western Michigan as part of the U.S. Department of Ed. And we do need to note that the opinions in this presentation are those of the authors and not of the U.S. government. A project of this magnitude certainly couldn't be done without help from a lot of folks. We had many graduate students who helped us, colleagues across the nation, test administrators, and of course our teachers, parents, and students who contributed to this research. And as Sharon said, I am a co-author of the TILLS Student Language Scale, and as such I would expect to receive some royalties. My goals for today, there's two big ones. I do want to present you with the Student Language Scale, get you familiar with it, but also provide you some of the psychometric criteria that makes this a successful assessment tool, hoping that it's something you would consider choosing, putting in your toolbox when you have students with possible language literacy disorders. And then by the end of this webinar, you should be able to take a look at a completed Student Language Scale questionnaire and be able to determine, does this scale show me a student who is likely to have a disorder including dyslexia and would need further assessment, or is this a rating scale of a student for whom there isn't a need for further assessment or who maybe needs a different level of intervention? So why do we need a screening tool? We know that early identification of students who are struggling with language or literacy is a key component to improving their chances for academic success. And so knowing which students require comprehensive assessment and which may be appropriate for less resource-intensive RTI services, I think is important. We've got limited time, we have limited financial resources, and it makes it important that screening be quick, easy, relatively inexpensive, but it's got to be valid and reliable. The TILLS SLS is going to be used to demonstrate screening that can be administered by nearly anyone on the education team, that will gather information from multiple informants for a student's sound word and discourse sentence level language skills, and we'll talk more about those in a minute. And it covers the 4 language modalities of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. I want you to think a minute about ways that we try to categorize language skills. I think sometimes we talk about our oral language skills, the speaking and listening, or maybe we talk about written skills, reading and writing. Another way we frequently talk about language skills is thinking about them as expressive skills, so our writing and talking, or conversely receptive skills, our listening and reading. But the problem with thinking about language in either of these ways is that evidence has never been able to support these kind of dichotomies. When we look at data, we can't find an expressive factor or a receptive factor, and the data don't align either with oral and written factors. So we can't get factor analysis to show performance on tasks that we think being expressive and receptive to hang together. So what factors do influence language literacy performance? And what I'd like to take a couple of minutes to share with you, those who've seen other TILLS presentations or are familiar with it will recognize the Quadrant Model. This is a model that Bishop and Snowling, as well as Katz and colleagues, have been working on, and it talks about language in 2 different language levels. So Dr. Nikki Nelson has incorporated this in the TILLS model and talks about the sound word ability levels. And then if we plot on the vertical axis sentence discourse ability levels from high to low, if we plot both of these from high to low, then we should end up with a quadrant where we can categorize language performance. So those students who are doing, have average sentence discourse ability and sound word ability skills are going to fall in that upper right-hand quadrant. They're going to be our normal language kids where their written and spoken language is developing typically. Conversely, if both sound word ability levels and sentence discourse ability levels are low, we get our what we often refer to as our spoken or specific language impaired kid, where both spoken and written abilities are disordered. In the upper left-hand quadrant, this would be the students where their sentence discourse ability skills are okay. So they've got good listening comprehension, their sentence formulation when talking is good, but they're really struggling with some of these sound word level abilities. So we see problems with non-word reading, problems with reading fluency and spelling, and in their written work we see inflective errors pop up. And so this would be a profile that would be consistent with dyslexia. And finally, if a student has the opposite pattern where their sound word abilities are good, so these are kids who are spelling okay, oftentimes their reading fluency is good, in fact maybe they're even hyperlexic, but as soon as you look at their comprehension, both orally and in written, we see difficulties there, and these would be what we might consider probably an under-identified group of students with specific comprehension deficit. Since part of this webinar is designed to look at kids with dyslexia, I want to take a quick run through the simple view of reading, and this was a model of reading comprehension proposed by Goff and Tunmer in the 80s. And so if we think of language skills using the quadrant model and those 2 levels of language, I think it fits very nicely with the simple view of reading, which tells us if we can evaluate what a student's decoding skills are, or word recognition, or according to our 2-level model, the sound word level, and we know what their oral language comprehension skills are, which is often assessed with listening comprehension, or on the second level, the sentence discourse level of language, then we should be able to predict what that student's reading comprehension is going to look like. And we know with our students with dyslexia, it's that first variable, that sound word level structure, the decoding that is most impactful on their reading comprehension. And so we get this pattern of dyslexia where the oral language skills, the listening comprehension, is definitely better than the reading comprehension. And then there was a redux of this simple view of reading that Tunmer and Chapman proposed in 2012 that talked about the importance of the influence of vocabulary on all of these variables. So vocabulary is going to influence students' abilities to decode. It's going to affect oral language comprehension and reading comprehension. And then we know, too, that students' abilities to understand what they read can influence the acquisition of new vocabulary. Now, I went through this pretty quickly, but my colleague, Dr. Nikki Nelson, who's the lead author on TILLS, gave a wonderful webinar this past summer on Identify Dyslexia using TILLS. And I've got a screenshot here that shows you if you go to Brooks Publishing Company and their Resource Center, they have all the webinars listed. This one's definitely worth your listen to. It's about 60 to 70 minutes with some case studies, and I think Nikki does a lovely job of providing information that would be useful to any of us that are working with students with dyslexia. The TILLS SLS is available two ways. For those of you who already have the TILLS Examiner's Kit, it is part of that kit, but it also can be purchased separately. And we just completed the SLS manual that should be coming out in 2017, and I imagine that Brooks Publishing is probably going to package the SLS questionnaire pads with that manual too as a separate offering. Let's take a look a little bit more closely at the SLS. So the TILLS SLS is an evidence-based questionnaire, and that's important, and I'll provide the evidence in a bit, that can be used to gather multi-informant input from parents, teachers, the students themselves, or others regarding a school-age student's language literacy skills and other strengths and needs. Yes, the entire school age. So you can use this with your students as young as 6 years old and as old as 18 years, 11 months. The TILLS SLS has three sections. The first section is a 12-item rating scale, and then we have a checklist of abilities for marking language and non-language areas that are easiest for the student, and that same checklist is repeated for marking areas that are hardest for the student. And finally, we have an open-ended question. So looking at section 1, the 12 items, these are descriptive statements. The informant is asked to rate the student on a 7-point Likert scale, and the instructions have them compared with other students of the same age. Circle a number that shows how good the student is at, and then we have our 12 items. The first 8 items are linguistic, and items 9 through 12 are cognitive social. So items 1 and 2 are asking about school vocabulary when listening or talking. So be thinking about each of these and how they might fit into the quadrant model of which might be looking at sound word level activities and which might be looking at the sentence discourse level tasks. So items 1 and 2 are asking about school vocabulary when listening or talking. Items 3 and 4 are asking about that sound word level ability for reading, decoding, and for written spelling. Items 5 and 6 ask about listening comprehension and spoken expression of stories. And items 7 and 8 ask about reading comprehension and written formulation of stories. And you might be wondering about that term stories, but our preliminary research showed that the term stories worked best for getting our respondents to rate the construct of comprehension and formulation at the discourse level. As a quick aside, when we first started with this scale 12 years ago, we had a lot of our colleagues, experts in the field, give us suggestions on things to do, and we ended up with a 52-point scale that really was an orthogonal, organized around the 2 levels of language and the 4 modalities, and really trying to get at these fine nuances. But as you can imagine, 52 questions is just way too many, and it was too sophisticated, especially for parents and those that don't have the same understanding that we do of language and literacy. And so it was stories that work best for getting at that sentence discourse level. The last 4 items on the scale ask about cognitive and social skills that we think are closely associated with language literacy abilities and academic and social performance. So item 9 asks about following directions, 10 asks about being organized about schoolwork, 11 asks about paying attention in school, and the last one asks about interacting socially with other students. And if needed, this last item can be rephrased as, how good is the student at making friends and talking to other students? When we did some factor analysis of those first 12 items to see what was going on, it was interesting, if you let me get my stats geek on here for a second, that there was this clear pattern of loading of two factors. So we see that the first 8 items did load on factor 1, and if you know factor analysis, it doesn't name the factors for you, but it made sense to us that this factor would be called language literacy. And then the last 4 questions did load together, and they loaded on factor 2 that we labeled cognitive social. So that I think that just was really exciting to see that the evidence supported the structure of the questionnaire as we kind of designed it a priori. As we look at the second section, we've got 2 checklists of skills that are made up of non-linguistic as well as linguistic ability areas. So Gardner, in his theory of multiple intelligences back in the 80s, he emphasized to us that people could be smart in different ways, all of which have value, that some people are good at language and literacy, but others we know are good at art or dance or music, mechanical, which we describe as putting things together and taking them apart, sports or math. These non-linguistic ability areas are represented in the 2 checklists, one for marking areas that are easiest for the student, and the same checklist is repeated for marking areas that are hardest for the student. The 2 lists also include listening, talking, reading, and writing, as well as social skills, which can be explained again to the student as making friends and talking to other kids. The checked areas on the easy and hard list should be mutually exclusive. So you should not get the same ability identified as both easiest and hardest. This ability checkmark section of the SLS, we think, can provide insights into areas of strengths and weaknesses that aren't assessed by our typical language assessments, which should perhaps be assessed in other ways or encouraged as areas of strength for the student. The third section is the open-ended question. What one thing do you think is most important to help this student do better at school? And this question is purposefully open-ended. It allows for a wide variety of responses which can reflect personal meanings, but it also requests the informant to prioritize what they're seeing as the area of greatest concern. So comparison across SLS forms that are completed by multiple respondents should reveal some common themes, such as we see things like the student needs to get better at reading, or they need small group instruction, or they need spelling work. Some informants may indicate that the student would benefit from more help at home or school, and some may specify curricular areas that are particularly difficult for the student, such as science or social studies or math. Finding areas of agreement across informants triangulates perspectives, which can help us prioritize areas to target in intervention planning, and this includes guiding the selection of curricular content areas from which we might do informal assessments. Instructional and practice material might be drawn from also. Okay, so you saw what the questionnaire looks like. Who can be an informant? An informant can be anyone who has an opportunity to observe the student's language skills as well as the student themselves. Now, for scoring purposes, for pass-fail of the screening, it needs to be a teacher or a parent. The perceptions, we know, may vary to a degree based on the experience of the informant and the context in which they observe that student performing. So a parent may not see as much written performance as a teacher, or a special education teacher may have a slightly different perspective from a classroom teacher, but that's really okay, and we discussed that in the TILLS Examiner Manual and in more detail in the SLS Manual coming out in 2017. We designed the SLS with easy to understand directions, and thus it could be sent home with the student for a parent or a guardian to fill out. We made it so that if an informant cannot read English, it is acceptable to read the instructions and items to them, and this is true for younger students who may still be learning to read and who may also need help marking answers on the correct line. So especially some of those 6- and 7-year-olds, they needed some help making sure that they weren't putting 2 answers on the same line and skipping a line. We found it typically took only 1 to 3 minutes to complete a form, and it also could be completed at a parent-teacher conference or nearly any time one wishes to collect an informant perspective. The SLS has been validated for 3 purposes. First, examiners can use it to quickly screen for language literacy disorders. Second, educational teams may gather input about a particular student's strengths and needs from multiple perspectives when the student's struggling academically. And third, the SLS can be used to gather multiple perspectives for any student or for classrooms of students, whether or not there's concerns. And this could enhance home and school communication. During development of the SLS, we held several parent focus groups, and it was kind of exciting to see that the participants revealed that they felt they played a bigger role in parent-teacher meetings when both parties were asked to complete the SLS and the results discussed. And I'm wanting to make sure I didn't trip over what I said there about screening. We know a screener can't diagnose. The screener isn't going to say, yes, there is a literacy or language disorder. It's just going to tell you that there is a higher risk for it. So I do want to make that clear. You do have to do a further assessment to confirm whether or not there is the presence of a language literacy disorder. As I said, for the screening, the administering can be as simple as asking the classroom teacher to complete it. Should take that 1 to 3 minutes. But we would hope that you'd want to gather input from parents too and the student. Scoring it is quick and easy. It does not require entering data into a computer. You simply look at the first 8 items of a questionnaire that's been completed, again by a teacher or a parent, and if 2 or more of the first 8 items are below a 5, this indicates the student has failed the screener and should be further evaluated for presence of a language literacy disorder. The screening purpose of the SLS is to identify students with language and literacy learning difficulties who need comprehensive individualized assessment and possibly extra learning supports. Teachers' ratings on the first 8 items of the SLS meet high sensitivity and specificity screening for language and literacy disorders. The evidence-based cut score for making these decisions, as I said, can be expressed as 2 or more less than 5 on the first 8. And that same cut score criterion can be used to decide if the parents' rating scales are consistent with the presence of the disorder. The students, however, their self-ratings are not as sensitive and specific as teachers and parents and should not be used for screening purposes. However, we think they may contribute important qualitative information to discussions about the students' needs, concerns, and priorities. Items 3 and 4 are particularly sensitive to identifying students likely to present with a profile consistent with dyslexia, and I think that makes sense when we think about that simple view of reading and the decoding piece being the classic profile. We see what items 3 and 4 are asking about. It just makes sense that those are items that have been found to be consistent with the profile of dyslexia. And we found that the informant responses to items 3 and 4 also correlated highly to performance on the TILLS subtests that do make up that sound word composite. So in the blue box there, that's what we're showing, that the ratings by teachers on items 3 and 4 were correlated at 0.671 with actual student performance on sound word level tasks on the TILLS assessment. Screening results, if they don't show failing, they still could signal a milder concern about language literacy risks that might lead to provision of response to intervention program or multi-tier support system as part of early intervening services focused on language literacy development. A system for providing additional supports generally is accompanied by ongoing progress monitoring, and here's where we think the SLS can come into play again. So if a student maybe did not fail the screening, but it was recognized by the team that they needed some extra supports, one of the facets of that is to continue to monitor their progress. The SLS is designed to be able to be reused at any point in time, and if at any point in time during that rescreening you found that same criteria where 2 or more of the first 8 items were scored below a 5, then that would indicate the need for further assessment. Using the SLS for screening purposes can assist in early identification. This may be particularly common in early elementary grades, so it's not uncommon to see kindergartners, first graders, maybe second graders being assessed, especially when achievement of basic reading and writing skills is a key curricular goal. However, the SLS can be used for screening students for teacher and parental concerns in higher grades. That's why I said it could be used for kids as old as 18 years, 11 months, And we know that screening in the later grades for language and literacy problems is supported by research. Katz and his group in 2012 showed that language literacy disorders may be late emerging. So older students who fall below the cut score criterion on teacher or parent ratings should be referred for comprehensive assessment, just as the younger students would be. For students being evaluated to determine eligibility for special education, gathering information from multiple sources as part of the assessment process, as we know, is a requirement of IDEA. So that is, the assessment teams, we have to use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather relevant, functional, developmental, and academic information, including information provided by the parent. So the SLS can contribute key information to this process. Having multiple informants complete the SLS also helps teams document the degree to which problems are apparent and of concern to people who know the student best. In developing the SLS, again, I said we held these focus groups that included parents of students both with and without disabilities, and some commented that they felt like true members of the planning team for the first time when their responses to SLS questions were part of the discussion. Examiners may ask teachers at any grade level to complete the SLS as a screening tool for whole classes of students or for individual students who may be struggling. In either case, it's important to explain the SLS in such a way that teachers can give their honest opinions without being influenced by knowing what constitutes a cut score. Teachers who are using the SLS to know the students better, which would be Purpose 3, could complete a form for each student and send forms home for parents to complete and bring back to parent-teacher conferences. In this case, teachers could also lead students in their classrooms to complete it as part of a group activity. At parent-teacher conferences, teachers could look at the joint rating scale with the parents and discuss similarities and differences for the ratings to make the discussion more interactive. Isn't that what we want? Any concerns could be raised, but this would also be an opportunity, just as importantly, for parents as well as teachers to describe strengths and student interests. And in such conversations, I think it's important to remember that not everybody has to agree. It still could be the representation of their true opinions, even if we don't get total agreement. So in providing a little bit of the evidence base, the validity of the SLS for screening depends primarily on its ability to predict how a student will function in other situations. So we know screening tools usually give us a pass-fail on whether or not a person has a high risk of a disease or a disorder. Passing it means they have low risk. Failing it indicates a high risk. So here I show you what we found. We found that teachers actually demonstrated really high sensitivity. 93% of the time of the students that were in the sample, they were able to identify accurately with the SLS students who did have a language literacy disorder. And they also have high specificity, because it doesn't do any good if you cast your net so wide that it catches everybody. You don't want to catch the people who don't have the disorder, and so that's what the specificity is all about. And with teachers, 90% of the time, if the student had normal language, that's how they rated them on the SLS. So they weren't over-identifying kids without problems as having problems. So 93% would mean they were missing 7% have it, but the 90% specificity means they were only identifying 10% who didn't have it. And as far as behavioral screenings go, that's really good. And to give you some sense too, the threshold for a screener for behavioral sciences would be a 0.80 for sensitivity and 0.80 for specificity, so we're well above that. Even the parents showed good sensitivity. They were at 85 and 83. So again, comparing to those thresholds of 80 and 80, we still find good rates of sensitivity and specificity. With concurrent validity, you want to make sure that there's evidence that the tool is valid for its stated purpose. So with the SLS, we wanted to make sure that we were actually measuring the constructs that we say it's measuring. So here we show a table that indicates correlations of the SL items with the TILLS composite scores that should be related. So items 3 and 4 are sound word items, and so they should correlate really well with the sound word composite on TILLS. And we see that with the teacher ratings, the correlation is a 0.671, and that is significant at a 0.001 level. With the sentence discourse items 1, 2, and 5 through 8, it's even higher at 0.720. And with the language literacy factors, or items 1 through 8 as a total, we're still at 0.752. So we were really excited to see that we had good concurrent validity for the questionnaire with actual student performance. In addition to evidence of validity, you want some evidence that your tools have reliability. And that's going to help you to know that what you're using is stable both internally and across time and across informants. And so this is what we call reliability, and I have here for you one measure. A lot of people use coefficient alpha, and I did report that here, but I'll tell you we did omega first because we know that coefficient alpha can sometimes be influenced by the length of items in a scale. We knew we only had 12 items in the scale, so we chose omega. And what you're looking for are numbers that get close to 1.0. So we're really, really pleased again with teachers and parents being at 0.96 and 0.94. Went ahead and did alpha, and you can see it's almost identical numbers. So we have some evidence of really good internal reliability. With the intra-rater reliability, this is an index of the consistency of scores found for the same person when comparing ratings by the person of the same student at 2 points in time. So we wanted to make sure that there was enough time between test, retest, that the teacher or parent or student, in this case teacher or parent, didn't remember what they wrote, but that enough time, that not so much time had passed that student performance had changed. And so we picked a 180-day period, and you can see here again that we have high ratings, 0.92 for teachers, 0.84 for parents, for the total 1 through 12 items. Okay, I'm trying to buzz through this as quickly as I can. I've got a couple of case studies to go through to show you how to use the SLS practically. Let's start with an 8-year, 9-month-old boy in grade 3. His history shows us that he does not have an IEP. He was in our language literacy group, which meant that there was some concern, and the concern in this case was that the school had identified RTI services, so he had not been identified with a language literacy disorder, but they were recognizing that he was needing some extra help. And the question was, should he be tested or identified? And so let's take a look. The teacher and the parent both filled out a student language scale. And the first thing we're looking at is those first 8 items, and does this meet the criteria for high risk? And the criteria again was 2 or more items of the first 8 that are below a 5. And we can see for both the teacher and the parent that's the case, especially for the teacher. Those first 8 items, nothing was above a 4. And then I would say the next thing I look at is I do look at those items 3 and 4 to see if they are particularly lower than the other items, because that's going to start to ring the bell that perhaps this is a student with a dyslexic profile. In this particular case, everything's kind of looking low. When we look at the checkmarked area, we see the things that are easiest are things that are not particularly language literacy. They are things like sports and social. And that reading and writing, reading has been marked by both the teacher and the parent has commented when asked what one thing do you think is most important to help the student do better at school, the parent writes reading and writing. And the student did complete one, and this one always makes me a little bit sad. This is a student who recognizes he's struggling compared to his peers and didn't rate himself very highly on anything, and says what one thing would help him do better? Listen. So what you're seeing here, I don't have too much time to go through this, but this is the strengths and weaknesses profile that you get when you give the whole TILLS. And you see the sound word level in the light pink under both oral and written language, and the dark pink is the sentence discourse level of language skills. This is a mean of 10 with a standard deviation of 3, and so anything in the gray area is within normal. And we see for this boy, the sound word level skills such as phonemic awareness and non-word repetition are particularly low, as is non-word reading, non-word spelling. Interestingly, reading fluency is not so bad, but that, as you recall, is one of the things that had been targeted to work on, and it seems as though the intervention is helping with that specific skill, but we still see quite a discrepancy with really low sound word level stuff. But some of the sentence discourse level stuff is weak too. The vocabulary, which is the VA, is a standard score of 5. That's particularly low, as is the social communication, which is fairly vocabulary heavy as well as understanding the intent of the language. So this is a student who, had they been given the comprehensive assessment, would have had a identification core score of 14, which is below the cut score of 34. Yes, they would have had a score consistent with the presence of a language literacy disorder. But let's take a look and say, is it consistent with the diagnosis of dyslexia? So the sound word composite is a standard score of 53 and sentence discourse 63. A lot of times I look to see if there is a discrepancy of more than 15 points, since that would represent a standard deviation, and we don't have that. So I think this student probably fits best on the quadrant model in that lower quadrant, as having difficulty with both sound word abilities and sentence discourse abilities. It could be dyslexia plus language impairment. There definitely was a need to work on sound word level structure, but this child also needed some help with vocabulary and story structure too. And then one more, a 7-year-old 10-month girl in grade 2. She did not have any preschool services. She does have a positive family history of reading problems, which we know can lead to more likelihood of reading problems. Her IEP had reading, decoding, and fluency goals. LD was her primary eligibility. She was not getting any services for language impairment, and we could ask the question, should she? Was this purely just dyslexia, or might there be a need for something else? So let's take a look at the screener, the student language scale. Again, we're looking at the first. We're looking to see if 2 or more are below a 5, and with the teacher we see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of the 8 items is below a 5. So right there's a fail, and we would recommend that you do further comprehensive assessment. The parent also would have met the criteria. For things that, what one thing would make is most important to help the student do better at school, the open-ended question, they both agree, learning to read, getting her reading better. So looking at that profile again, now this time we see a little different profile than we saw with the earlier case. This one, the sentence discourse level stuff all seems to be pretty good, with the exception in written language of reading comprehension. Now one other thing that I would recommend that you look at is the listening comprehension, which with my cursor I'm pointing to the 12, very good. Reading comprehension, very bad. Again, classic sign that there's probably some a dyslexic profile here. And so yes, this student also would have qualified as language literacy disordered. Now we do have that more than 15-point discrepancy between the sound word and the sentence discourse composites. So is this consistent with the diagnosis of dyslexia? And yes, definitely think this is a student that we can feel confident. LD is her primary eligibility, and she is getting some help. Should there be some goals related to oral language? Probably not. She seemed to be doing pretty good with that. It really needs to have more of that explicit instruction at the sound word level, both for her writing and her spelling, and to help with the reading. So in summary, I hope that you'll see that the student language scale could be useful for screening individuals or large groups of students across the school ages. I think that's cool that it covers all those ages. Minimal costs in teacher and student time and district money. I've provided evidence that I hope supports the predictive validity and has shown the high sensitivity and specificity specifically for teachers and good for parents. We've got good internal factor structure, good intra-rater and retest reliability, and I think as important as all these quantitative things, the fact that we can get some really interesting qualitative information to help with some of the collaborative planning that goes on. So I know I talked very quickly, and even with that I think we're out of time. I'll let Sharon pop back in here, but as she said at the beginning, we're going to definitely take a look at any questions that came in. We'll get those answered. Some of those answers will go up on the website. Some of those I'll be happy to respond in email to. So again, thank you everybody for your time. I hope this helped you to see what the student language scale might be able to do for you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was fantastic. And yes, unfortunately we are out of time. We did get a bunch of questions, and Michelle and myself will follow up with you via email and get you those answers. If you have any more questions or you want to learn more about the SLS or TILLS, please go ahead and log on to brookspublishing.com/TILLS, and you can find tons of information there. There's also included in the handout that you downloaded. If you have any additional questions, just feel free to contact us at brookswebmeeting@brookspublishing.com. So thank you so much, Michele. Thank you, Maryland Speech Hearing Association, for providing the CEUs for us today. And on behalf of Brooks Publishing, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.